Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 18th of May 2021. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on board. And we're in for a treat this evening with Veronica, going into some very interesting areas with relating to property. So many questions, so many answers that we're seeking, so that'll be fun. Just before I start, I will just, as normal, just highlight that this isn't financial advice. We're talking in general terms only. We don't know your specific circumstances, so don't take it as financial advice. If you need financial advice, go speak to a financial advisor. Do play nice in the chat room. We do monitor and moderate the stream as necessary. This is as at the 18th of May 21 if you're watching in replay. Use @Walk the World if you want to get my attention, because there are always lots of conversations in the chat, which I encourage. But frankly, if you want to get your question to my attention, use @Walk the World. And in fact, you can use Super Chat, which means you can also potentially make a contribution to what we do here, and also make sure that your chat question goes right up to the top of the queue. So without further ado, let me get rid of that. Voila. And I'm now going to keep my fingers crossed and press this one, and hopefully... Veronica, are you there?
I am, with one light.
Yeah, well, one light's better than no lights, eh?
It's all a bit shaded.
Well, it's funny because we've actually bookended our day today, right? We recorded a Elephant in the Room podcast this morning, and we had technical problems there at my end. We had a power cut.
We did, in the middle of it, yes.
And we had issues connecting, so we seem to be sort of surrounded by technical problems. However, we'll carry on regardless, and great to have you on the stream. Look, there's so much to talk about tonight. I've already got a bunch of questions from beforehand, so let's get straight into it. But I think it would be good, why don't you just give your own introduction, because it's a very long introduction when I try and give it, because you've got location, you've got the buying services, and you've got the first buyer services. So give us the whistle-stop tour, and then we can take it on from there.
Well, if anyone recognises my face, it's because I might watch Foxtel, and I'm a co-host of a show there called Location Australia. But I really, in my day job, I don't do much television these days. I mostly podcast and actually run a buyer's agency, and also we're developing an online resource for first home buyers, which we're very excited about. So Good Deeds Property Buyers is my day job. Buyer's agency based in Sydney. The Elephant in the Room Property Podcast is the podcast. I've also got another podcast called Your First Home Buyer Guide, and Home Buyer Academy, where I am joined by co-founder Megan Wells, and we have developed an online course and mentoring program for first home buyers, which we're very excited about. So I think, and I wrote a book too. I wrote a book called Auction Ready: How to Buy Property at Auction Even Though You're Scared Shitless. And I actually give. I think I've actually still got a code. If anyone wants to buy a copy, I'll give you a 30% discount. DFA is the code. How's that? I think I've covered everything.
Still trying to get rid of the book.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to flog them. No, they're print by demand. You know that. I don't have boxes of them in my garage.
I was teasing. Okay. Now, we had a chat 7 or 8 months ago last on the show here, right? And at that stage, we were facing into the gale with regard to COVID, right? And everyone was thinking, oh, look, CBA is saying prices could drop 32%, right?
Yeah.
And everyone else was saying, oh, it looks pretty bad. And even my own modelling was suggesting that the trajectory was down rather than...
Imagine that, Martin.
Yeah, very surprising, really, But, things have changed. I guess, first question, why have we seen this massive turnaround? What do you put it down to?
Oh, God. Look, there's a number of things I think that are at play. I mean, obviously, we've got very, very low interest rates, so money's cheap, and you've got banks that are, starting to reduce the borrowing hurdles that borrowers have got to jump through. I also think that that's sort of backed up by an enormous backed up demand, really, in Sydney in particular, that we had a boom that ended in middle of 2017, 2 years before it sort of, the election, and then it started recovering. And then, it really was starting to come back very, very strong at the beginning of 2020. Then we had COVID. So I actually think we almost got 3 years of pent up demand combined with everything else. So, that's sort of my layman's non-economic economist view of why we are in the situation we're in.
And to what extent do you think home buyer and first-time grants and those sorts of things really
drove that end of the market? Well, that end of the market, sort of the entry level, absolutely. I mean, the first home buyers, unfortunately, if they sort of haven't stopped for a moment and really added it all up, they don't work out that these grants aren't there to help them. They're actually there to help the construction industry. And in this particular case, coming out of the back end of lockdown, there was quite a lot of, the renovation, the home builder grants and accelerated and increased thresholds on first home buyer grants, et cetera, to help more first home buyers into new property. And so that's designed to stimulate the construction industry, which I know no surprises there. So that end of the market, yeah, absolutely. It's those first home buyers that sort of sit there and go, oh, the government's going to give me all this money. I'd be silly not to use it. But I guess if they take the time to sit down and work it out and add it all up, they realise that actually it's not a benefit to them because they're buying an asset that potentially could be worth less than they pay for it, and certainly a lot less than the discounts and the incentives they've been given. So the long answer to that question, yes, there's been a lot more enter into the market and take advantage of that, but it's a shame.
And interestingly, of course, if you look carefully, Western Australia is a really interesting case study, right? If you take the federal and state money of $55,000, guess how much homeland packages went up on day one?
Yep. Yeah.
So it's a zero-sum game, unfortunately. Now, I just want to make this point, and Xavier made the point too, availability of credit. Of course, credit availability, a lot of it is being driven by much free lending from the banks. The lending standards have probably come a little looser than previously. APRA and the Reserve Bank basically said, no, it's fine, you can make interest-only loans now, whereas 3 or 4 years ago they were saying, oh, interest-only loans, no, don't do that, right? So we've got this different environment with regard to availability of credit. And the low interest rates means that people can borrow, 15% more, 20% more than previously and still have the repayments, looking roughly reasonable. Trouble is, of course, it doesn't necessarily deal with the repaying of the capital, which is the other thing I always come back to when you think about this.
No, it is an interesting point too, isn't it? And look, the other thing is that, particularly the Sydney and Melbourne boom that was ended in the middle of 2017, as I referred to earlier, that was largely driven by investors. Now, there's a big difference to what's happening at the moment, and this has been fueled by owner-occupiers. And one thing I didn't add in as to why, and this is something I actually said at the beginning of lockdown, I had this sort of sense that if everyone's been cooped up in their homes and they really feel the need for more space, then they're going to come out like greyhounds chasing a bunny. They're going to be wanting more space. And that's pretty much what happened. And then, of course, you've got that combined with this sort of this idealism of around sea change, tree change, and you've got to move out of the cities into regional areas as well. So you've got this very unusual circumstances where everywhere pretty much the dial is pointing up, except, and I know you've spoken about this many, many times, in areas of massive oversupply, and particularly when in areas where there's been a lot of investor stock or buildings that have been built specifically for the investor market. And obviously that's a different kettle of fish. But certainly the house side of things, it's been phenomenal. And, if people can borrow more money, all it does is just pushes the prices up. And we've seen... I've been tracking certain examples in Sydney, and these aren't all necessarily properties that we've inspected or even recommended for a client, but I've seen some in a 4-month period up to 34% growth, not improved, nothing done to them. That's just insane.
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, there was a few articles today. This is the one from the Fin Review that said regional housing boom to run for 2 more years, and they're quoting, northern New South Wales regional where prices have gone through the roof. Down here near Ostermere, near where I live, there are some prices that are 25% higher than they were a year and 18 months ago. That's because a lot of Sydney people came and basically bought down here. They wanted the space, they wanted the the block with the with the sort of the pool and everything else, and they could afford it because prices down here are way lower than they are closer into Sydney. So those regional stories, I think, are pretty important as part of trying to understand what's going on. But I thought what we might do is break the market down a little bit and just talk a little bit let's start with units, right? And then we'll go on to houses, and then we'll go on to some of the regional areas and try and paint up a bit of a picture. But before I do that, I just want to ask you one other thing, because I think it's quite relevant, because, of course, Victoria also announced the land tax increases and stamp duty increases, in fact, yesterday, which basically means that property over 2 million are going to actually have to pay a lot more. Investors are going to pay a lot more. And I'm be interested in your perspective in terms of land tax versus stamp duty, and whether that's a big difference and a big change, and how do you make sense of what Victoria's done?
Well, I'm not intimately familiar with what they've done, but what is interesting is that that's an interesting way for a state government to step in and try to rein in property price growth. Because if you've got upgraders less enthusiastic about upgrading because they're going to have to pay more stamp duty, then that's going to put a big wedge in everything, right? It's going to slow things down. And likewise, if investors have to pay more land tax or more stamp duty, then they haven't even re-entered the market in force. In fact, I think the latest ABS lending figures are around about 30% investor borrowing, which is on par with sort of how much property in the country is owned by investors. So that's sort of expected, right? That's the sort of right number. Now, so if they're at that level, then that's sort of healthy, you could argue. But if they're going to actually start putting disincentives in the system for investors, then you would think that percentage of the total borrowing population is going to go down. So what will that do to prices?
Yeah, and the point about land tax versus stamp duty is quite interesting, right? Because in New South Wales, they're sort of hatching a plot that you can choose, right? But it's a one-way choice, which is something you spoke about this morning, which a lot of people don't realise. So let's just explore that, right? So you can choose, if you're buying a property, to pay land tax or stamp duty, but it's a one-way choice.
Well, you've got to remember, it's not legislated yet. So state governments don't really like stamp duty. Apparently, they much prefer a broad-based tax, and economists don't like stamp duty because it changes behaviour. They want taxes that don't change behaviour. So they see land tax as a tax that doesn't change behaviour, right? So you can get an economic theory about that. I don't really like it, but anyway, I'm not an economist. So what's been proposed in New South Wales is that stamp duty for properties up to, there's a threshold as well, and I don't know the exact dollar figure. It might say, for argument's sake, it might be $2.5 or $3 million, something like that. So anybody buying a property over whatever that threshold is still going to be paying stamp duty. But under that threshold, they want to go through a transition period to get all of the properties on a land tax or a broad-based land tax rather than paying stamp duty on transactions, right? So they want to sort of even out the curve and actually, make the government's earnings more predictable. So by doing that, it's very unpopular. How do you suddenly change a tax from, yesterday somebody bought a property and paid stamp duty. The next day, the next person doesn't have to pay stamp duty. They get to buy, they get to pay like a lower amount every year. So it's complicated to try to get this through. And not only that, you've got a situation where the government has to still manage its cash flow. So they've put together this plan for a transition. And that means that with every new transaction under that threshold, I think one of your commenters there said it was 2 million, under that threshold, every new transaction, the buyer gets to opt and say, well, I want to pay stamp duty, which is roughly 4% of the purchase price. And so anyone who's thinking, well, I'm going to own that property for 10, 15, 20 years, which, to be honest, buying property is a long-term proposition, in my view, should be. So, maybe everyone would look at it this way. They'd say, you know what? I don't want to pay land tax every year. I'll just do an upfront stamp duty. And anyone who's thinking they might only own it for a couple of years, it might be in their favour to actually just pay a much smaller amount land tax every year rather than one big chunky 4% stamp duty. But the thing is, though, the part of this plan is that if you opt for the land tax, the broad-based tax, then the next time that property is sold, that person doesn't get that option. So the buyers only get the options for as long as it takes until every property is actually in the land tax system.
Right. So, folks, the point there is that if somebody chooses to go with the land tax, you can't go back subsequent when they sell it, right? So there's a little bit of a drift towards land tax over time. And of course, the problem with land tax is if you're going to live in the place for a long, long time, you could end up paying a lot more because you're paying every year. You don't know what the land tax rate's going to be. It could go up. Whereas at least with stamp duty, you know precisely what you've paid because you pay it up front and you can roll it into the mortgage. So
and it's a tax deduction if you're an investor.
It's tax deduction.
A capital.
Yes. Exactly.
Capital cost.
Yeah. And James makes the point that it's land tax is a variable, stamp duty is one off. Exactly the point we're making, right? So it's really interesting. And I'm not sure that people have fully woken up to what this plot looks like, right? But I think that it's nice for the New South Wales government. It's interesting though. I saw if I can find this chart. I think is it that one? I think it is. Yeah, this is actually showing that the stamp duty moves with property turnover, right? So it sort of rides the cycle together, where, of course, the truth of the matter is that if you go the other route and you go land tax, then it doesn't ride the cycle the same way. So it completely changes the flow and character of the revenue stream. So from a New South Wales point of view, it's actually more secure once you got land tax because they're going to pay it every year come hell or high water. And of course, if prices go up, the land tax goes up as well. So it seems to me that it's wonderfully fixed in favour of the state government, despite the fact that a lot of people think, oh, it's great, I don't have to pay stamp duty. Well, maybe be careful what you wish for.
But also, if people don't have to actually foot up the bill for an extra 4%, that's just going to get built into the purchase price.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yep. Guess what? Prices are going up further.
Yep.
Oh dear. Yeah. Now, I saw a question. I'm trying to see whether I can find the question again. I probably can't. I'll find it in a second. But anyway, look. The question was apartments, right? What's going on with apartments, and is it time to think about buying apartments, particularly where prices have come down from their peaks? Because prices of apartments are still falling, particularly in the inner suburban ring. What's your sort of feeling with regard to what's going on, and should we separate the high rise from the low rise and the new from the old?
Yes. And look, apartments are particularly difficult to use macro data to understand because all of the data is chucked in together, and even townhouses are lumped in with apartments. So you've got new, you've got established, you've got really old, you've got recent, you've got Art Deco, you've got warehouse conversions, anything that's strata title basically, or company title, even if there's those floating around, are lumped in the apartment bucket. So you do need to pull it all apart. And the big sort of thing that I look at is really supply. So I look at areas where there's massive supply, lots of cookie cutter apartments, all same, with lots of sites where there's potential for continued supply, and those types of markets are performing completely different to the rest of the country's property market. And I don't like to talk about Australian property market. It's the one time where every capital city and every regional area seems to be growing. But those and it's not just inner city apartments. These are big areas. Like for instance, there's big in Sydney. There's certain areas. There's Ryde, there's Rhodes, there's Mascot. There's loads and loads of Green Square. Loads of these monumental sites that have got thousands of apartments in them. Those at Alexandria, they are struggling to sell. Unless you've got a property with some level of scarcity in them, then they're a nightmare. Anything that's been purposely built for student accommodation, anything that's been purposely built just for investors, that sort of stuff, it has shown its weakness. COVID, I should say, has shown its weakness. And so, some people are saying, oh, I'll be opportunistic. Great, I'll go and pick up some of that stock. But it's got inherent problems in it. They're fundamentally not good properties, which is one of the reasons why they're suffering at the moment. So I would say under no circumstances go in there and try to pick up all these bargains. That said, even we do on the Elephant in the Room, we do a monthly data episode with Kent Lardner and our Suburb Trends episodes. And the most recent one, which I think came out last Friday, we looked at the idea of, well, all these areas of high density and oversupply, massive vacancy, rental vacancy rates, falling rents. the JobKeeper cliff, all these things should point to quite a high level of stock coming onto the market. And even in these areas, I have to say that we were all surprised that the stock levels have not been coming on in the volumes that we would have expected. Transactions are down, buyers are definitely not there, but the stock levels and the inventory levels actually haven't been changing too much, to be quite frank. So clearly people are able to hold on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've had the chance to speak to a number of people one-to-one about their particular circumstances. And I tell this case study with permission of the person. But that person in Redfern bought 6 small apartments in a single block 2 or 3 years ago for students. Only 2 of them are let at the moment, and they're paying 30% less than the rent from last year. The other 4 are vacant. The capital value has gone down, and even with the lower interest rates, the cash flow is negative. And of course, the question is, what do you do? Because basically, first reaction was all the eggs in one basket there. Not a smart strategy, perhaps. But of course, at the time, the idea was that there'll be thousands and thousands of students who'd want accommodation, need accommodation, and they pay reasonably good dollar. So that was the strategy. Unfortunately, it's failed completely.
Well, the thing is with student accommodation, it's never been a good idea, really, as an investment strategy. And the main reason I say it's never been a good idea is because any sort of property that only appeals to investors as buyers is inherently a weak property, because you want a diversity or multiple different types of buyer groups that would be interested in buying that property. If you've only got investors, let's face it, investors don't get that emotional about property. They not necessarily that analytical, but they don't necessarily get that emotional. So they're not going to push prices up because they got to live there themselves, right? So fundamentally, there's a problem with student accommodation even before COVID came along, and obviously COVID just came and took it to town. I did have an idea for that guy. I presume it's a guy, but because only guys would make such silly mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
But I did have an idea for that guy. What about consolidating? If it's in a good location that potentially owner-occupiers or other tenants would want to live in, does he own any of them that are next to each other that he could knock a wall out and actually make them bigger? Or perhaps he could go into some sort of conglomerate collaboration with other owners in the building, and they can change the makeup of the building. That might be one of the something to be explored as a long-term strategy.
Well, it's interesting because that was actually one of the things that I discussed, which was, you got to change the game. You can't play the same game and win, right? It's not a winning game. So you got to find a way to change the game, right? And so one option, as you say, is to make them into a smaller number of larger properties. Unfortunately, they're not all next to each other. They're actually on different floors.
So he's diversified within the building.
You'd have to find some other people, right, who want to do the same thing.
Well, there's got to be other people hurting in there. Maybe not hurting as much as him, but there's got to be other people hurting.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the other interesting question, of course, is defects, and particularly Cookie Boys just asked a question about major defects. And your podcast from the other day was going down this route, right, talking about the problem of defects. I have to say that I listened to the podcast that the New South Wales guy seemed very bullish that he was across it and was going to sort it, right? I'm not seeing that on the ground, though.
It's interesting, actually, because I've been watching, observing some of his stoushes in LinkedIn. He's pretty feisty. Particularly there was that story that I brought up, and I can't think of the woman's name off the top of my head, but the property at Kellyville made the papers. So there was a woman that had purchased an apartment in Kellyville off the plan, and she's an engineer. So she's a bit more clued up than the average apartment buyer. And she took an architect through for a specific pre-settlement inspection and identified a number of defects. Councils agreed, et cetera, et cetera. So hit the news. There's been quite a lot of people that have been, attacking David Chandler, who's the New South Wales Building Commissioner, on social media about it. So he didn't really answer my specific questions around that in the interview. because really I think the big gap is the people that are in that limbo land at the moment. They've actually already bought off the plan and they haven't settled, or they have settled and the property's only a few years old, and it's sort of, well, how are they going to get their defects sorted out? Now, he was saying that their first priority was to do the cladding, to replace flammable cladding, and that's great. He also has conducted some research into the level of major defects or structural defects, and personally, I didn't think he shied away from it and how bloody appalling it's been. He's certainly like on a warpath, and I do hope that everything he says comes to bear. I do hope that all the legislation he's talking about actually does it, that the regulator is no longer a toothless tiger, that it actually starts to actually create change. And it has to, because the simple fact is that how can buyers possibly have confidence? However, then you've got the same state government incentivizing people to buy brand new property. So I think you mentioned on our podcast this morning, did you say the system's, what did you say, that's broken? No, you said something. I threw it out. I wrote it down actually what you said. What did you say?
Well, basically I said it's pulling in two directions at the same time, right? So on one hand, they're saying buy, buy, buy. On the other hand, there's all these other issues, right? And look, the fact is that structural defects are in many relatively new high-rise buildings across the country, right? It isn't just one or two. It's systematic and it's structural because of the nature of the processes that have been wired in, the way that work is done, the fact that it's built down to a price, particularly now with the cost of construction materials going up. So this is a continuing problem rather than actually being the odd individual property, right?
Exactly right. And it's certainly not the exception. Interestingly enough, there was Dr. Nicole Johnson from Deakin University put together what she calls a preliminary report into the state of building defects in the country. Now, and when I say in the country, she did it she researched buildings in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. Of the three, New South Wales was by far the worst. Queensland was the best and Victoria was the middle, but they were all pretty bad. And so seriously, obviously there's some serious issues across the board in this country. Now, in New South Wales being amongst the worst, we have had the most publicised and horrific examples of what can go wrong in these buildings. And there has been so many more that hasn't even hit the newspapers. There's been other buildings that have been evicted. Other buildings have never been occupied. There's quite a lot. So this is a very, very widespread problem. And I think the issue is that buyers are not demanding enough. And the other thing too is you've got this system that basically supports the developers and the builders to get away, or has done in the past, and hopefully that does change. And then these organisations are not building to last. They're leaving individuals who have no idea about buildings to actually try to clumsily navigate their way through this absolute nightmare. So it's a terrible situation, and I'm really appalled that our governments have allowed it to get to this point.
Yeah, and that is really the point, because it is actually a governance issue, right? I mean, they basically pared back the controls on the construction sector and brought in self-certification. And self-certification really is just looking at the paperwork, not looking at the real building, right? And so they often don't pick up all the defects. The second point is that once the property is completed, it then moves from the builder to the manager of the property, and there's some really complex questions about roles and responsibilities there. And whilst they've got this, 2% I think they hold back now. They're just trying to see whether that can sort of fix all the things down the way. The fact of the matter is that there is very little obligation once the thing is built and sold. It then falls back onto the owners of the property. And we've seen, I suppose, the Mascot Towers is the worst example, where effectively now they're going to have to knock the whole building down, and they're going to lose 80% of their capital on average, and many people are going to go bankrupt as a result. I mean, that's the sort of the worst end. But your point is dead right, Veronica, that this is not just an isolated example, right? Well, of course, we've got Mascot Tower, we've got Opal Tower, and we've got another one that was in the newspapers the other day too. But there are hundreds and hundreds of buildings across not just the state, across the country, that are actually defective, right? And by the way, you also have low-rise as well, which are also defective, right? So this is a structural problem for the building sector, right?
Pardon the pun.
My concern is that really the regulators and the people trying to solve it are sort of making faint progress, but this is way more complex and difficult. And the trouble is that individuals get caught at the end of the process, right? So if you go and buy a property in a high rise, right, it's not easy to do due diligence on that property to be able to know whether it's got flammable cladding or whether it's got defects in the basement. In fact, quite often people don't even look in the basement, right? So it's really difficult.
Yeah, it's very true. And the issue, well, I guess most individuals got no idea what a building should look like, so most people, and if you try to get a building and pest inspection done on a building, well, the most inspectors are they charge you a fortune because they're big and they can't get access to everywhere anyway. So there's a lot of issues with trying to do due diligence, and certainly it's been very opaque and trying to get the information from the owner or from the agent or from the strata manager. There's no obligation on the strata manager to talk to people who are looking to purchase in a building. So that whole side of things does need to be looked at. But you've got to remember that unfortunately, property is buyer beware. And one of the things that I've really learned from working with Megan on Home Buyer Academy, we've gone through state by state and looked at the levels of disclosure that are required. Believe it or not, New South Wales has the highest level of disclosure of any state or territory in this country. And even then, I'm appalled at what vendors don't have to disclose. It's up to buyers to work it out. But most buyers have got not the faintest idea what it is that they need to look at before they buy a property. And so even in a strata report, there's no actual regulation around what needs to be in the strata report. So people think they get one and they think they can tick that box, I've done that, but they don't even know how to read it or even how to work out whether it's got everything in it that should have or not, or how do you even compare one building to another. They've got no idea what they're doing. So it's a massive minefield, and apartments are way more complex than a single standalone house, and yet we just blithely go in there and hope for the best.
Yeah, and my view is that many people don't even know the questions to ask.
No, they don't.
And they sort of assume that the agent is telling them the full story, and they assume that the particulars are correct, right? Overlay FOMO, this is a really good one. If I don't get this one, I'll never buy property, right?
Yeah.
Which is what I'm seeing a lot of at the moment. And the environment is not one that's conducive to making good decisions and buying good property, right? And there's an interesting question, which I'll bowl at you directly because we discussed it this morning on the podcast, which is, how do you know whether a property's got flammable cladding or not?
Yeah. Well, so there's a register, but the register is not publicly available. And there was a decision made to not make it publicly available because they didn't want everyone freaking out, right? So, which is all very nice. But certainly if you're going to try and buy a property, Look, the very first thing is go and find out what cladding looks like. It's not actually hard because you go to a building and if it's got something stuck on the outside, then it's clad. It's like a weatherboard house is clad. It's clad in weatherboard. Buildings that have got some sort of something stuck to the bricks, it's not rendered, it's clad. So that's the first thing. If it's clad, then you got to go, right, well, it's clad in something. Is it flammable or not? And if it is flammable, what's the plan? And if it isn't flammable? So, these direct questions, when you actually ask a sales agent a direct question like that and they give you a lie, get it in writing, right? So ask the question in writing and get the answer in writing, because if you ask them a direct question, they can't lie. And they can't say they don't know if they can reasonably find out the answer. And they can reasonably find out the answer because they, as the vendor's agent, can ask the strata manager. But you, as the buyer, may or may not get an answer from the strata manager.
Yeah, and that really is the point, that you need to press the point. So you need to make that list of questions, right? And there's some pretty standard ones, right? Which we should always be thinking about when you're thinking of high rise. I mean, there are questions about flammable cladding. There are questions about any structural defects known in the building. By the way, walk down into the basement and look for the cracks, right? Don't be attracted by the shiny taps in the apartment, right? Look around the building. Walk around the building, right? Also, I always say to people, go at other odd times of the day as well. Don't just go, on a Sunday afternoon when it's quiet. What about the middle of the day? Right?
I love walking through the basements because I like walking up and I'm thinking, okay, where's the garden beds? Where's the pool? These things leak. And then you can see evidence of, it's like a cave, all these stalagmites and is it stalactite? Can't remember which ones go down, but there's a lot of buildings with stalactites. Yeah. And, if you got some of that lime stuff dripping on your car, there's problems there. I mean, evidence of leaks is something that is widespread. It's common, but it's, if they're there, they're probably elsewhere in the building too.
Yeah. Another good example is where the plate, the concrete plate for the floor, extends out from the building out onto the balcony at the same level, right? So have a look at what happens where the door meets the balcony, right? Because almost always you'll see water coming in there as well. So there are things you can see. Yeah.
There's definitely evidence. Yep. Talking about what happens when there's defects. I mean, we interviewed, I can't remember her name, but she's the executive of the Owners Corporation Network. Oh my God, I'm terrible. I forgot her name. She was telling stories about people that have, sitting in buildings, living in buildings where the carpet's been ripped up and they've had to jackhammer a drain basically through the lounge room because every time it rains, they've got to let the water out somehow. This is while they're waiting for the whole claim process to go through, because it's not as simple as there's a leak, we'll fix it. There's a leak and who's responsible, then have to go through all the various layers and try to work out who they can actually get to pay for it. Do they have any money? Are they still in business? If the building is 3 stories or less and you're in New South Wales, it will have homeowners warranty insurance. And if it's within the period, then you might have to sue them if there's no one else to get the money from. And if it's 4 stories or over, you're relying on that 2%. Developers, they call it levy, but that's only been in recent years. So, and then trying to get the money, it's not easy. These funds might be there, but it's not like you go, that's great, I've got a leak, well, let's just go and get it fixed. This stuff can inconvenience people's lives for years, and it's a nightmare.
And that's the point. You make a decision on one day, but the fact is you have to live with it. And actually, that's the problem. You have to live with it. It isn't,
Yep.
You can't blame necessarily the agent or the strata manager, etc. And on strata, the other thing, of course, to bear in mind is that we're seeing this in a lot of the surveys. The strata prices are rising. So the costs of strata are going through the roof. And that's a pretty significant issue with regard to, many people these days.
Well, here's the thing, though. I mean, I see some buildings where strata levies are actually going down, but that's usually because somebody's got, a good committee has got involved and gone through a process of actually looking at bolstering up the Capital Works Fund and getting them to a healthy financial position so that they can reduce levies. What often happens is that, particularly if there's buildings that a lot of investors have been in, then those investors want those levies kept low. Because it's just a cost, right? Yeah, sure, they might get a tax deduction, but still it's a cost. So that be argued or voted for keep Capital Works Fund contributions down for as many years as it can be. And quite often when these buildings start showing signs of issues and things that need to be addressed, that's when the levies have to start being increased in order to pay for the stuff that needs to be done, and also build a fund. And it's only after that period of time that people realise they need to do this. So, and often with a new building, you'll find for many years that people are voting to keep the levies low. They go, it's new, nothing of this needs to be replaced. But they really do need to be contributing to, on an ongoing basis, to the actual maintenance of the building. As one building inspector said to me, buildings start to deteriorate the minute they're built. So that's even a good building. You still got to maintain the thing.
And that's true, by the way, whether it's a house or an apartment, right? But it's just that in the apartment context, particularly high-rise strata, it's much more complicated. So I think the net conclusion with regard to high-rise is folks be really, really, really careful, right? Almost always you are buying a heap of trouble unless you have done a really significant amount of due diligence and the price is right, and even then it's risky.
I'll give you a couple of other examples of where it's not a bad idea, and that is if the building is well over 20 years old, loads of history, and you have loads of evidence then of not only how well that building has been built, but how it's weathered all sorts of, literally weathered all sorts of storms, but also how well it's run. There's some buildings that I bought into for clients that are, maybe up to 15, 20 stories, but they're amazingly run buildings. They're run like corporations. And they're also the ones that I'm thinking of that come to my mind now. They're about 40 years old now. So, they got loads of history. They're very, very solid, well-maintained buildings. Love them. And that's the exception to the rule, but you need to have that level of history that you can investigate before you make a call on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, investigation, ask lots of questions. Don't jump at something just because you think, oh, yes, I've got to get that one, right? I mean, again, the fear of missing out, you put the blinkers on, you ignore all the warning signs, and then you repent at your leisure.
I think often though that people are jumping at this stuff because the rest of the market is so hard.
Right.
It's a very, very difficult market to buy in at the moment. It's not fun for anybody. And when people give up and they just throw their hands up in the air and say, okay, I'll go and buy one of them, they're easy.
Right.
That's the rule. That's act in haste, repent at leisure.
There's plenty of that around, isn't there? Yeah. Okay. Now, so let's move from the units to houses and think about the land house continuum, because there's definitely more stuff, right? More things to think about again, but prices have gone up a lot. So what are you buying? Are you buying at a point where it makes sense or not?
Well, a lot of people say, oh, land is where the value is, so therefore houses are always better than apartments. And you would draw that conclusion after listening to our conversation thus far as well, but it isn't always the case. Not all houses are great properties to own, and from an investor's point of view, not all houses are great investments. So I would still, so the land part of the house, right, is meant to be the asset that goes up, whereas the house itself depreciates. It sounds like the dog's come into your studio.
Good. So just to explain, we have two doggies, and I have to just get them sorted out for a second. So hello, come on in, come and say hello.
God, look at that setup you got there.
There you go. So this is Meteor. There you go. And this is Luna. Come on, Luna, say hello. Here we go. So those are the two doggies. So what I'm going to do is, good girls, I want to throw you a question, and then I'm going to actually just go and sort the doggies out. And
I'll talk, and I won't listen to the dogs. I won't be distracted by the dogs.
So this is real life intruding. So look, the question is, you made the point that not all houses are equal, right? So the question is, what is the distinctive characteristics you should look at to find the good ones versus the not good ones? What are the sort of list of things you'd go through?
Here we go. The first thing you got to be thinking of is the location, as I mentioned before, that not all land is valuable. So I've always favoured inner city locations for the reason that, and let's think pre-COVID for a minute, and particularly if you're thinking, say, Sydney and Melbourne, then the people with the high income jobs want to live closer to the knowledge centres, which is, in the CBDs, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's, and also you think about scarcity. And if you look at the rings of an onion, right, the inside rings are smaller than the outside rings. So there's less houses on the inside rings than there are on the outside rings, and so on and so forth. So that's the whole scarcity argument, that closer into lifestyle centres is going to be more highly in demand than further out. Also, you've got the type of property that is built in these areas, because they are older style properties and they've gone through the gentrification process. Then typically a Victorian terrace is very appealing. There's scarcity in that because they can't build Victorian terraces anymore because we're not in the Victorian age anymore. And so, so you've got to look at the scarcity of the land, the value of the land, and the scarcity of the asset within that land. So if you pick a location that is highly desirable by people that can afford to live there, that have good incomes, there's good population growth, there's good lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then what you're looking for is the icing on the cake, and that's the actual asset selection within those areas. And so what people often think is that if you buy in a really good area, then it doesn't matter what you buy, but it does. It absolutely does. In every area, you've got a median growth rate, and above, you got 50% of properties that perform above the median, 50% perform below. So what you're looking for are properties in each area with the characteristics that appeal to the most amount of buyers. And so, I talked about Victorian terraces in inner city areas, for instance, ones with period features, ones that have been well retained, ones that have been well renovated, ones that have got a northern aspect to the garden, ones that have got parking, ones that have got higher ceilings, all of those things that actually that local buyers will go for are the things you look for. But in an area where Victorian terraces are not prevalent, if there was a Victorian terrace, that's the one property that probably wouldn't perform that well, because all the buyers in a different suburb wouldn't be looking for a Victorian terrace. So it's about understanding the dynamics within each actual location and what the buyers in each location really want and will pay a premium for. So it's looking for areas with multiple buyers with good incomes, and then what is it that they want? And there's certain things that are universal, like good natural light, orientation, good floor plan, a good flow from indoors, outdoors, well-balanced rooms, good size bedrooms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are the sorts of universal things that people will look for, tree-lined streets, close to parks, good transport, walk to the station, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got deeper than that, other things that set an individual property above all the others in the area. So there you go. That's there's a comment there from Jason's disagrees. Old buildings often have no damp course. So Victorian terrace, which has had all the damp coursing done and no damp issues, or they will have a small amount of damp issues, but people will actually pay a premium for an older home in excellent condition than they will for a brand new property in these areas where you've got heritage homes.
Yeah, it's interesting because the heritage story is quite interesting. We actually had a property at Cremorne, which was 1880. And, we had to do a bit of work, remedial work, to deal with damp proof and what have you. But really the bones were remarkably strong.
Yeah.
And you look at some of the modern stuff and the framing and everything else, and it's just a completely different ballgame.
Well, you look at certain areas where, so in Sydney, for instance, I might look at, say, Canada Bay Council area, Rod Point, Five Dock, that area. And you've got sort of buildings built in the 1930s that are all being knocked down, and they're building these mansions there. Then you look across the bay to Haberfield, which was built in the sort of around the turn of the century, and that's a heritage listed suburb with loads and loads of Federation houses. Now, not to say that the Greek and Italian immigrants didn't get in there and ruin them a little bit in the 70s, but generally speaking, it's a suburb that has retained its heritage feel, and that's more valuable as a result. And those big mansions, they'll get knocked down in another 40 years and something else will be built in their place.
Yeah, go figure.
You see that in certain suburbs already, yeah.
And look, we certainly know that the upper end of the market has been very, very strong, right? So interestingly, in 2017, that was the previous peak. The top end of the market dropped first and dropped furthest compared with the rest of the market. And it's moved back up more strongly. And now I don't know what your experience is, but my experience is that quite a few people buying at that top end of the market don't need a mortgage.
Yeah.
They've basically got free cash available and basically are just buying because, relative to other asset classes, it looks as though it's a better bet. That's basically what's going on.
I've actually been surprised how much cash is actually in the property market, more cash than I've ever noticed in my 21 years in the industry. So at the moment, and at that higher levels, you're absolutely right. They're not borrowing. People say, how does someone afford $5 million for a house? And it's like, but they're not borrowing $5 million. It's not like a first home buyer. They just saved up $1 million, as a deposit. They've sold something else. They're already in the market. They've actually got, growth from that. So it's a completely different ballgame what happens at those upper levels. And I tell you what, it's funny because at the beginning of COVID, I thought when the stock market crashed, you know, at the very beginning, and I said to some clients, I said, oh, this could be interesting because if these people were, you know, if the people in that price bracket are affected by that, they will either flock to property as feeling safer, or they may have burnt the cash. Like they may not have the money anymore. And I don't know which way it's going to go, but I have to say that end of the market, it held firmer than the rest of the market in that sort of 6-week hiatus period at the beginning of lockdown.
Yeah. And look, I guess the fact of the matter is that quite a few people had wriggle room, so they were able to sort of take their time. We've also got some international purchases coming back to Australia, yes. People who were living overseas. You know, 300,000, I think, is the number that I saw of people who got back to Australia, and quite a few of them have come back with a lot of money to buy stuff. So that's been one of the other things that people haven't realised.
And quite a lot of them have actually come back. They already own a home and they've come back and moved back into it. So it's actually had an impact on the rental market at that end as well. There's a real shortage of stock. Yeah,
no, that's exactly right, and that's why the prices are, you know, rising quite fast. I'm not seeing it uniformly, and I'm going to draw now a contrast between those types of property, the top end of the market, to the outer suburban areas, you know, what we spoke about this morning as the high growth corridors, right? Growth in terms of numbers of property, growth in terms of all the new construction, but not growth in terms of value. Completely different ballgame.
Yes, very much so. In fact, last year's Full Law Forecaster report that we put out for the elephant in the room, the 10-year review I did was in Logan, which is southeast of Queensland, just south of Brisbane, and or South Brisbane, I should say. And yeah, there was all these articles, all these spruikers out there saying the growth corridor. All these poor buggers have bought their investment properties up there and moved there, and you know, so little growth, if at all, in terms of their own values.
Yeah, and look, unfortunately, that's when mortgage stress is very high. So this is just one of the mortgage stress maps I have, which happens to be Sydney, and you can see there Western Sydney. It's much worse than towards the coast. And in fact, if you look in Melbourne, you can also see a somewhat similar situation with, again, whoa.
That was quick.
Pushed it twice. Yeah, pushed it twice. There you go. Yeah, again, high growth corridors, so Narra Warren, you know, Point Cook, places like that. It's sort of a bit consistent, unfortunately. So a lot of those people who bought into those high growth corridors, a lot of them actually first generation Australians too. So they've moved in from overseas. They've got large mortgages. And when you look at their work patterns, a lot of them are actually multiple part-time workers rather than full-time, fully paid workers. So they've got pressures. So that's where I think a lot of the pressures are. So again, you know, if you're buying in some areas, expect one dynamic. If you're buying somewhere else, a completely different dynamic going on.
Yeah. I think the sad thing with that, as well as a lot of these, you know, these migrants here, they've all got their friends to move out there and buy out there as well. And I get that they want the community, but I wondered if they all realised what they were doing to their wealth.
Well, and of course, the fact a lot of those places have very little infrastructure, right? So there's lots and lots of houses and not much else. And they're on small lots. They're relatively poorly constructed. And the point is they're still building new ones just down the road, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a property, you paid top dollar for it. It's now worth less than it probably was, and the ones down the road will be more attractive. So you've got that horrible grind going on there. And I think, again, people perhaps don't understand that, you know, prices have not gone up in those areas since 2017. They're still going down. And you know, I've sometimes used my modelling to make that point, that you can't assume just because the top level index is up that all postcodes are moving at the same pace in the same direction. Just that's not the way the market works.
No, not at all. And the other thing too is it takes decades for these things. They're like turning the Queen Mary, you know, like it takes decades for these suburbs to settle in and actually get established. and start to divorce themselves from being handicapped by all the newer stuff that looks, shinier and newer than theirs, and also has all the incentives that are designed to take first home buyers towards them. So this is, and it's a bit like gentrification. People say, looking at in Sydney, for instance, they look at Redfern. Oh, Redfern's gentrifying, and it is, but the whole of Redfern certainly isn't gentrifying yet. And even when I think back to, I was looking at Darlington the other day, and I was like, it's a good 15, 20 years since we first started seeing signs of gentrification there, and it's still got a long way to go. So these things don't happen quickly.
No, that's exactly right. It can take a long, long time. And look, the point about gentrification is that often those places are also places where they're knocking down standalone houses on a block, and they're putting up high-rise units or low-rise units or villas, which is...
I don't call that gentrification.
What do you call that then?
Bastardization. Yeah.
I agree.
That's just development. That's all that is.
But worryingly, there is a lot of that around the place, right? And I see it again when I do my one-on-one sessions, right? And you can go. I mean, I was looking at a place out of central Brisbane, about sort of 10k up the road from Brisbane, right? And there, it wasn't gentrification; it was actually just chopping them down, demolition, rebuild, smaller. And the whole character of the place. And actually, if you look at somewhere like Redfern, right, and I agree there are areas of Redfern which are improving, but there are also areas where it's not improving at all. I think the whole character of the place has completely gone, haywire.
There's parts of Redfern that are actually really lovely. Those are border Surrey Hills, and there's some lovely spots. And I think when you're talking about gentrification, what you're talking about is actually renovation. Demolition versus renovation. It's only worth gentrifying. It's only worth renovating if actually it has some sort of charm to it and some sort of historic significance. And councils often have these conservation areas where that's the whole feel is being preserved, and there's money gone into actually bringing the place up rather than just mowing it down and starting again.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, I think the point there is, even in the housing sector, right? Even in the house sector of the market, again, you have to go granular. You have to really get into some detail. You can't just assume all houses are going to go the same way.
Nope.
And we haven't even talked about geographic differences in terms of states, because of course, Victoria, New South Wales, perhaps most dynamic. Brisbane less dynamic in terms of sort of a slow drift up. And Megan was on the other week talking about, Brisbane is slow and steady, right? So it's not having the same.
Yeah, she has this analogy. She talks about the horse races, but I mean, I don't really 100% agree with that. I never see, like tortoise, the hare and the tortoise. I never see Sydney behaving like the hare. It doesn't stop. She thinks it goes up and then it goes down, then goes up, and it's not quite like that. But she has actually said to me that she's been shocked. She's never seen Brisbane so competitive. She's never seen prices rise so rapidly, and certainly hasn't their auctions performing the way they are as well. So, it's a very strong market in Brisbane at the moment.
No, it is, absolutely. And it's interesting that, the data that I see is also suggesting that is the case. Again, more houses than units, though. There's a lot of oversupply of units. And interestingly, some of the, I'm thinking Sunshine Coast places there, Sunshine Beach in particular, right, have gone up dramatically, sort of 20% in the last year. I mean, they are pretty exceptional locations, right?
Yes.
If you go inland, there's nothing like the same growth. So again, you have to actually tease it out and work out where the good and the bad actually is. Which sort of takes me quite nicely into my next conversation, which is the regional story, right? Because we saw a considerable migration to regional areas, and we discussed earlier on that some of that was to do with the fact that people wanted more space, and particularly working from home. We also have seen a number of regional areas moving up dramatically. I guess my question is, what's your sense? Do you think this regional drift is over, or do you think it's going to continue?
Well, I only have a sense here because, of course, I don't have any hard data to support anything here. But I guess there's a human behaviour element. There's also we have been doing quite a few regional episodes for your First Home Buyer podcast as well. So talking to regional buyers agents and getting a sense of what's going on, and even actually for the elephant in the room as well. So I think that I personally feel that there will be there'll be a little bit of a U-turn at some point. It won't work for everybody that is actually making that change. And at the moment, we're all sort of fresh in this very exciting sort of, work from home and the flexibility and all the rest of it. But the realities that come with actually moving out of an urban area into a regional area, I don't think they'll suit everybody. So I would think that there will have to come a point where things will slow down, or there'll be that U-turn happening. But that's just time and human nature. What I actually think will happen, and what I have seen anecdotally, I've been hearing this in various places, is that when people are sort of making these moves away from the urban areas because of affordability and lifestyle. And then when the regional areas get up to a point where they no longer feel as attractive from a price point of view, the differential in terms of what they're getting versus what they're paying, there's a price sensitivity that hits. And it's going to be, it's different in every area. But once that gets hit, I do believe that buyers will actually start to put their hands back in their pockets and go, you know what, I'm not sure I'm going to make this move. I don't want to pay that price. I'm going to wait this out. And now I'm hearing that anecdotally by a number of different agents, both buyers agents and sales agents in different areas. So, I guess we'll just wait and see. I don't necessarily think the brakes are going to be jammed on, because I do think that there's this dream of Australians that want to do the sea change and the tree change. So there's sort of that latent demand that comes from just that general, dreaminess. It's a bit like the old, that everyone wants their own home. It's a little bit now that the upgrade of that is everyone wants a sea change or a tree change. But I do wonder whether reality will set in, especially when organisations actually start returning their workforces into the office more. Doing a 2-hour commute each way twice a week, that's got to wear thin.
Yes,
even
exactly.
twice a week.
Yeah, absolutely. And the traffic's getting worse and worse and worse. We even have our own traffic jams here in my local community, right, in a relatively small place compared with a few years ago. So, there are certain times of day you say, well, I won't go. I'll just wait half an hour and let the traffic go past. It's crazy.
So you take all your city problems with you.
Well, that's right. And look, I must say, having moved out to regional New South Wales nearly a decade ago now, when I go back up to Sydney, the first thing I notice is the diesel fumes and petrol fumes in the air. And then I notice all the traffic, and then I notice all the people, and I think, oh, well, it's okay to visit, but I don't want to come back there.
Traffic in Sydney is disgusting. Honestly.
I know. And yet, of course, prices have risen significantly down here where I am. Austinmere is one of those places where prices are well over 20% higher than where they were, even a year plus ago. Wollongong is also looking quite strong too. So,
yeah, I mean, with good reason. I mean, in that northern Wollongong area, I mean, you're on a train line too. So people who might slightly longer commute, but hey, it's very doable. And Austinmere is one of my favourite beaches actually down there. It's lovely. So totally understandable.
Yep. Well, I think we story of our search was we looked from pretty much up at North Pacific, the beach north of Sydney, the famous one, right the way down to Gerringong, and we missed out the bit between the Royal National Park and Wollongong, thinking there was nothing here, right?
Because you drove down the freeway.
Yeah, we drove down the freeway, and then we suddenly realised, hang on a moment, there's this main rail line that goes all the way down, right? And then hang on, there are some nice little places. So, it was really sort of an accident, right?
Wow.
So it is interesting. It just shows you, you can do a lot of work. And we looked at thousands of different locations and properties, and eventually ended up down here. And even the NBN is sort of working here now. Finally,
well done.
Better late than never.
Not this morning when it dropped out.
That was because of the power problem. That was because they were digging up the road down the road.
Right.
You can't win. Now, so we're sort of coming to the last sort of chunk of the program, and I had a couple of questions from viewers beforehand, and the first one was first-time buyer trying to be sensible about multiples of income. How do they go about working out what they can afford rather than what the bank says they can afford?
Yeah, and of course I can't give financial advice. It seems ridiculous, doesn't it? Just this sheer amount of money that you can potentially borrow. especially with low interest rates. So you've got to protect yourself. The problem is that a lot of people, there's risk in borrowing a lot of money. Okay, you got to pay it back, or you got to make the repayments, and particularly when you're buying your first home, unless you've got a 20% deposit, which is very unusual, you owe a big proportion of that property. So that's very risky and it feels very uncomfortable. The problem is that when you try to reduce the amount that you borrow to a comfortable level, if you're not able to buy a cracker property, a really good quality property, then you could be shooting yourself in the foot and actually taking greater risk in other ways that you're not even aware of. And that is because you're buying a substandard property because you're trying to keep your debt low. So it's a challenge. And this is something that we do talk about a lot and try to teach in Your First Home Buyer Guide, because how do you work that out? How do you work out the difference? And so we run a Where to Buy workshop, which does try to teach people the differences around that and the sorts of areas in which they need to compromise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing I would say, that if you don't push yourself and you're buying a substandard asset, then you're running into problems before you even get started. Second thing is, if you don't push yourself and you're buying a property that you're going to outgrow of really quickly, all the costs, all the money you save, all the rest of it, you're going to end up expending anyway, because you've got transaction costs, another lot of stamp duty, sale costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If the market moves, then you're buying a greater asset. The gap between what you're selling and what you're buying is getting bigger and bigger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's really important to actually look at your whole long-term plan as well. When are you thinking about having kids? How much space are you going to need in the future, et cetera, et cetera. I know myself, when I bought my first property, I bought the smallest bloody property that I could, because I was worried about borrowing too much money. And honestly, I outgrew it in a year. This is a long time ago. And thankfully I've managed to survive all my mistakes. But this is the problem with trying to reduce your borrowing if you can comfortably afford more, or even uncomfortably. And I say uncomfortably, not because it's unaffordable, but because you're not used to having that debt. So I think you really have to look into what your options are at different price points before you make that call. Long answer. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, and that is the point, right? Again, what you're underscoring there, you've got to think about this really hard. You've got to do the work, right? Don't just rock up at the bank and say, how much can I borrow? And then base your purchase decision off what you can borrow as a multiple of your income, right?
Yeah.
Remember that the old multiples, when I used to do lending underwriting years ago, right, it was maybe 3 to 3.5 times, maybe one times additional income if it was there. So that was about the maximum you could get, right? Today it's 6, 7, 8 times. Now I know rates are lower, interest rates are lower, but as we said earlier on, there's also the need to be able to repay the capital as well as actually just service the debt. And the problem is that people are so leveraged into, particularly first-time buyers, so leveraged into their properties that they've got very little wriggle room. So if, for example, the income comes under pressure, or one party finds their job doesn't work, I mean, those things are absolutely disastrous. And so the question has to be, what is the right point for that individual? And there is no rule of thumb. You can't say it's always X or always Y, right? But you have to go through the thinking process. And one of the things I say, Veronica, is run the counterfactual. In other words, what if? What if this happened? What if that happened? How would you handle it, right? And remember that you can't use the get out of jail card of income growth, because we haven't had any real income growth since 2013, and it's unlikely to get any real income growth according to the Reserve Bank for the next 4 years.
Yeah. But the thing is that if you don't focus on capital growth, then that's your safest way, really, because at least if the property is growing in value, then you've got options. If you hit hard times and the property's gone up in value, then you've always got the option of selling. You try not to, obviously, if it's a good asset. And this is the thing, that by focusing on a quality asset and learning what a quality asset is, that's your safest way to invest any money in the property market. And I think that this is the scary thing, that people are actually buying assets, particularly with low deposits, like you say, that there's little wriggle room, but also if that property is not going up in value, then all you're doing is paying rent. with a whopping great liability and responsibility.
Yep. And that's the point with a long mortgage, right? You're still just paying rent, basically, right?
So it has to go up in value to make that worthwhile, to take that risk.
Yeah. And that, of course, is the big question, because, nobody quite knows where property prices are going to go. You could argue that the fall of interest rates is a one-off thing. All the government stimulus could be a one-off thing. They can probably find a few more to sort of just throw in there to continue the momentum. But, there is an argument to say, well, will we really see the sort of growth that we saw over the last 25 to 30 years, thanks to deregulation, low interest rates, and all those things? And if you look at a long-term view of history, right, over the last 150 to 200 years, there's only been twice where prices have really been very strong relative to underlying inflation. So, this is unusual.
It is, but the thing is that there are properties that can go up, and there's areas can go up in value sustainably over time that outperforms everywhere else. and so it's understanding that. I mean, I'm not necessarily thinking every first home buyer is going to be able to go and nab one of those, but it's important to understand that you're buying an asset, and I think it's not just getting onto the property ladder for the sake of it. So, I mean, do you mind if I do a little plug?
Yeah, please plug away.
Well, thanks. We have a little $39 tutorial on homebuyeracademy.com.au. It's literally /workshop. And it's called the Where to Buy workshop. And that takes you through that process of looking through various lenses to understand what the possibilities are for your search. Because if you're going to push your budget, you need to understand why you're pushing your budget. So price is one of those lenses that we look at. We look at the property lens, the price lens, the position lens. And it's so educational in understanding the different push points. And you do need to get into that. And once you actually start this sort of process, we take you through a process. There's a spreadsheet there you fill in. There's lots of juicy things for people who love a bit of analysis. Once you go through that process, you actually start educating yourself accidentally almost, as in what makes a good property, what would make a good home, what compromises you're prepared to make, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that's a very, very worthwhile process to take you through. That's not taking you through all those what ifs, but it's certainly giving you a solid understanding about what the possibilities are for your purchase before you actually go blindly into it. It's a very small part of an entire process that we take our students through, but it's a very, very valuable one.
Yeah, and that's the point. I think you have to be methodical and you have to be process-driven on this, right? Rather than just being intuitive. One of the things that I find quite often is that people sort of get this gut feel they need to buy property, right? And then they get this gut feel that they can afford it because that's what the bank says. And so they get this gut feel and they see a property and so they fall in love with it and they want to go and buy it, right? And none of the mechanical processes that you've touched on and I speak about all the time are part of the story. And unfortunately, they might come out okay, but the risk is you don't. And then repent at your leisure because, as my friend Edwin always says, you actually make more money by buying the right property on the way in than almost anything else.
It's very true, but it's a lot of people say that about property, and the assumption is that it's the price you pay, but it's got actually very little to do with it. It's the choice of asset.
Yep.
So that's what that's about. Yep.
And that is the point. You make the right choice, right? Now, on that front, somebody asked a little earlier on, and I also had it before from somebody asking from Pete, who asked this prior, was what's the difference between value and price?
Oh, good one. Value. Well, do you know the value is really what someone's prepared to pay? That's what value is. And the price ultimately, I mean, it's a good I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. Because seriously, I price properties all the time. We price them in my business, and I've been tracking what properties are selling for versus what we're pricing them at. And this year, they've been trending up that gap between what we perceive as value based on recent sales. So that's really where the value sits. That differential has been sort of tracking away from, as in the price that someone's paying is being tracking away from the value. So the difference in price and value is probably the difference between a seller's market and a buyer's market is probably what I would say.
Well, I'll give you my spin on it, and that is that price is what the market is determining, right, at any point in time, right? The value to you is rather different, because essentially for some people they are prepared to pay more because for them it's the right property in the right location with the right facilities, right? For other people it might be a quite different value equation. And I sometimes think that we've got to actually understand that there is a market mechanism with regard to what prices are, but behind it there is a set of value assumptions that people are making, right? And there's probably an assumption about future growth, but also what the property actually is like, and is it in the right place, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's a really complicated question. Well, and what I would say is, of course, prices can change significantly, right, up and down, and sometimes the value that you thought was in a property turns out to be better or worse. So it's a bit of a catch-22.
We talk about objective and subjective measures and fixed and variable measures. And so we have a matrix that we look at when we're actually determining price versus value for clients. And it is important to go through, like everything, a good process, love a framework. It's got all of those elements in it.
Process. I tell you what, I must tell you a quick story. When I first came to Australia, I was accused of being very, very process driven, right? Because I come from the UK. Now, in the UK, I was accused of not having enough process. And I hadn't changed anything, right? So we in Australia are not very aligned to following process and following steps through. We seem to sort of go intuitively to the end state, right? She'll be right. Sometimes it's important to really follow process, I think.
Very, very important. We have processes in the business, obviously, but it's funny. I've had a line with some would-be clients, and I've sat down. They've been trying to tell me all these crazy harebrained schemes they want to go ahead with, and I'm like, look, we can do one or two things here. I can tell you, you can pay me, and I can tell you exactly what you want to hear and pat you on the back and send you off on your way, and you're going to feel fabulous, like you're the cleverest thing ever. Or you can pay me, and I will tell you what I really feel, what I really think, and it's totally up to you. And some people don't pay me, but I never ever will tell a client just what they want to hear.
No. Well, and you said to me on the show this morning that actually you got a bit of a reputation recently for coming in under market value, right?
Yes. Is that price or value? We see value under the market price. Yeah. Absolutely. As I said, we're a bit of a joke that we're good deeds property underbidders for a while there, because we kept finding out things about these properties. One client's like, "Oh, am I jinxed? Every time we look at a property, we discover something that means that he's not going to pay what he could pay for it, because we found out something that really, with that knowledge, you can't possibly pay anymore, and somebody without that knowledge did pay more."
Yeah, exactly. And I should explain to people there's too many comments on the chat for me to put them all up on the screen. So I'm being a bit selective just at the moment. In the last 10 minutes, one other question for you. Property investing. Property investing for a long period of time was seen to be the simple way to make money. Right? We've now had some of the tax breaks turned down. We've got very low interest rates, but it means that the tax breaks are also less advantageous than previously. And we've got a number of wobbly properties around the place and a lot of rental returns lower from where they were. So the question I have for you is, do you think property investing still makes sense?
I think property investing is a rich man's game. And you need to have a very good income. See, too many people approach property investing to replace their income. The reality is you need a good income in order to invest in property. And so I've never invested for yield. I've never encouraged a client to invest for yield. I never invest for tax breaks, and I would never encourage a client to invest for tax breaks. You basically have to think about property investing as if you have excess cash flow and you want to invest that money in a solid investment, then you could look at property, and you need to make sure that you're pretty good on your asset selection. Forget about the rent, because you've got a good cash flow. You're not buying it for cash flow. Residential property, that is. You need to buy residential property with a view to accumulating assets, and therefore you need a nice, big, fat, long runway in order to make that really work for you. And you set and forget and top it up every month, because you're going to have to if you want a good asset.
Right. So long-term strategy, right, comes back to those same principles.
Yeah.
And it's not an instant wealth generating engine.
Absolutely not. Don't be thinking that you're going to revalue it every year and then borrow the extra. It's not going to happen.
Oh, isn't that how it works? Okay.
No Ponzi schemes here.
So what about these people who say, look, I've got 50 properties and I bought the first one, I leveraged the first one to the second one to the third one, and I've just gone like that, right?
Well, those people, usually the most boring people at a dinner party, and mind you, people might accuse me of being boring too, but hey, they'll come and they'll try to convince me how clever they are. And I was honestly, get me out of here. It's like, first question I ask them, so how have you measured your success if they start bragging about it? Because they will. And it's like, they haven't usually measured it. You know, they're usually measuring it in the amount of properties that they have. Well, that's no measurement. Or the yield, and that's no measurement either. You know, and usually, because I made money. Well, how much did you make? How much could you have made? What's the opportunity cost? How does that compare with other properties that you could have bought at the same period of time, et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, there's no very reliable yardsticks that these people use. They only use their own inflated sense of self. So I have not yet met one of the quantity strategy that actually I thought, actually they got it right.
And look, you mentioned a magic word there, opportunity cost, right? It's something which people don't think about, right? But what it basically says is you had potentially an opportunity to buy X. What if you'd bought Y instead? Or what if you hadn't bought X then but did it somewhere different, right? Those are really, really important questions. People don't want to think about that, but it's a really important question.
And look, there's too many very mono-dimensional sort of thought processes that people go through when they're investing in property, and they just don't know enough. So they'll pick a couple of key points. And a classic is, and I did a case study on this one property. I've done many case studies on opportunity cost over the years, and this one particular property is a little cottage in Balmain, and the person who was buying it at the time said, it's a house for the price of an apartment, how could it possibly go wrong? And I was like, well, because it's a dog of a house, it's like a C-grade house. And I tracked it against what the median had done various times. It has sold over sort of a 12-year period, and it had tracked away from the median by $178,000 in that period of time, right? So but I've done well. But relatively to what? No one measures that, like you said. I also think that there needs to be an ROI on property investing that is about talking about the cash flow before. If you actually worked out, well, what are you putting into that a year, and then what are you getting back for that? So you punch in your rent return, you also punch in your capital growth. The real ROI comes into actually how much money you're spending to keep that investment in play.
Well, my experience, Veronica, is that very few people know that answer that question. You have to sort of force it out of them, right? List it all out, and then you've got to say, well, what about the sinking fund for the repairs that are coming?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. If it's a house, like it's an apartment, at least that's budgeted for. But if it's a house, absolutely. Have you factored that in? Yeah.
And so often not. And then you say, okay, what about the the interest that you're paying? Right, fine. And what about the strata fees and the agent management fees, etc.? It soon adds up to a very long list. And, one of the things I have in my surveys is net rental return, right?
Well,
which is an imputed net rental return. Right?
So I did some numbers on these some years ago and worked out that it was roughly 25% of rental income goes out in expenses, excluding interest, and that's whether it's a house or an apartment. It's sort of, I did a study on quite a wide spread of investment properties. It came at roughly 25%, give or take. That was before rents dropped because of COVID. So if people think they're going to get rich on rental returns, then they've got another thing coming. And in fact, we interviewed Matthew Ward, who's a buyer's agent and evaluator out in Orange. And we interviewed him for the Your First Home Buyer podcast. It was interesting because he was talking about some of these cheap properties you can buy out in central western New South Wales, $40,000 for a house. Get good rent, get $100 a week rent. And he goes, he sits there, he's really pragmatic. He says, it's great. Yeah, sure. It's a really good yield. $100 times 52, $5,200 a year. Air conditioners cost the same whether it's a $40,000 house, if it's a $200,000 house. Air conditioner costs the same. And it's pretty much wipe out your entire rental income if you needed to replace one. So I just thought that was a bit very pragmatic look at that sort of thing.
Yeah, and unfortunately, many people just never do the sums, right? And my view is, that there is still a story to be had here, but only if you do it really carefully, right? And again, you need to do the numbers. And look, I'm not an accountant, right? I'm a philosopher, but it's important to me to understand what the numbers are doing, right? And actually, it isn't that hard once you start. Once you actually go through your process that you have or whatever it is, take it step by step by step by step by step. You can get to a good resolution relatively quickly. You may not like the answer, but at least you'll know where you are and whether in fact you're going to make a really good or a really bad decision.
Well, this is the thing that we, Megan and I did with Your First Home Buyer Guide, really breaking it down and working at what those steps should be. I mean, we came out with what we call a PACE system, which is pace yourself, but 10 steps. But the order of those 10 steps is very, very important. And the order in which we do it is very different to the way in which most people go ahead and do these things. And so, process is very important, so important. And it's interesting, even our process of even coming up with this and testing this actually showed even how it was even more important than even we thought.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And I've just been looking down the stream. There are lots of other questions which we're not going to get to, but there's one here just to leave you to think about, and that is, are rates going to go up? Do you think mortgage rates are going to go up, or do you think they're going to stay low? And should you factor that into your thinking with regards to doing those sorts of calculations?
Well, I'll answer the question backwards. Yes, you should factor it into your thinking, absolutely, because one day they will. But in terms of when, who knows? I mean, all I can say is that there's the Reserve Bank did say they were going to stay low for 3 years, but then there's been various murmurings that, but if, mortgage data changes and, and if the economy does this or that or whatever, that could change. So you certainly can't rely on them being low forever. And so therefore I would budget and expect they're going to go up at some point in time, and don't get caught out.
Yeah, and my view is that rates could be moving up sooner than the Reserve Bank thinks, international situations. And remember that the Reserve Bank and APRA allowed the banks to reduce the buffer, right? It's really, really low at the moment. So I say to people, put your own buffer in. Just because the bank says you can do it at this level, maybe you should put your own buffer in and give yourself a bit of flexibility and ability to sleep at night.
Well, absolutely. And I just think that, getting good financial advice and getting good strategic advice from a broker that's not just about chasing the lowest rate, so that you can actually set up your offset accounts and your buffers and put yourself in a situation where you're not as exposed, when things change.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, look, we've hit 9:30. I mean, you were complaining about whether we'd have enough to talk about for an hour and a half. Well,
Jesus, managed it.
So I want to say thank you very much. Now, let me just give you the opportunity to do a plug or two with regards to where can people find out more about you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, look, I think go to First Home Buyer, what are we talking about? homebuyeracademy.com.au. I mean, you can get access to any of those little course. We do a free mini course there on how to price a property as well. And obviously you can get access to the Your First Home Buyer Guide podcast as well there. My logos are up. gooddeeds.com.au is where I live most of the time, I guess, and the elephantinttheroom.com.au is the Elephant in the Room podcast, where we talk about the things that people don't often talk about in the property market. I think that sort of gives you the three areas. And if you wanted to buy my book, go to Good Deeds and it's in there.
And I must just, again, plug the Elephant in the Room. They are a brilliant series of podcasts. They come out on a Monday every week, right? And there'll be one that we made today coming out in a few weeks' time. But there are some really, really good ones, and some of the back catalogue, still very, very good advice.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And it's been lovely chatting to you, Martin, as always. Appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much. Huge experience coming through there, and the chat was very, very supportive of what you said and some of the advice you've given. So thank you very much. Take care. Have a good evening. I'll take you offline now, and I'll just close the show. Well, there you are, folks. Really interesting conversation. Hopefully you enjoyed that. And, thanks to Veronica for spending so much time with us. Just to explain that next week, Damien Klassen will be on, and we'll be talking about certainty investing. Is there such a thing in the current environment? How do you go about it? And, frankly, is it really just, completely unknown, or are there things that you can do to actually increase the uncertainty of investing, particularly in the financial markets at the moment? So that'll be worth watching. And I just want to make one other point, that over on the other channel, on the Interests of the People, that's the channel that I run with John Adams. There are some shows over there that you may not be aware of because of the fact that channel is not always necessarily cross-promoted from this one. So go across on the Interest of the People and have a look at that if you'd like to know more about some of our economic conversations there with John Adams. Anyhow, with that, I want to say thank you very much for spending time with us. I want to specifically call out those who actually made some contributions tonight. Smooth Operator, thanks for your little competition, and for the other people who actually played along, and we've got a nice contribution to help fund the future development of shows. So thank you very much indeed for all of that time and all of the effort from all of those people. Enjoyed all the conversations, enjoyed all the questions, and I'll look forward to seeing you back this time next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off.